Today, Kenyans angry about tax hikes and IMF demands vow to keep protesting. Evan Gershkovich goes on trial behind closed doors in Russia.
And are you better off than you were 4 years ago? For the economy, it's complicated.
It's Wednesday, June 26th. This is Reuters World News, bringing you everything you need to know from the front lines in 10 minutes every weekday. I'm Tara Oakes in Liverpool.
And I'm Jonah Green in New York.
Kenyan police opening fire on protesters trying to storm the parliament compound. In chaotic scenes on the streets, protesters overwhelmed police and chased them away in an attempt to enter parliament. Protesters are angry at a bill designed to raise taxes and meet demands of lenders like the International Monetary Fund. One video posted on social media showed protesters inside the Parliament building calling on President William Ruto to resign.
You must go! Ruto must go!
Footage showed damage inside Parliament, which had been partially set ablaze. Kenyan activist Alma Obama, the half-sister of former US President Barack Obama, was among protesters tear-gassed during the demonstrations, a CNN interview showed. Ruto said an otherwise peaceful protest was hijacked by what he called organised criminals.
Today, Kenya experienced an unprecedented attack on its democracy, rule of law, and the integrity of its constitutional institutions.
Giulia Paravicini is in Nairobi and sent us this.
Today, I've been visiting morgues and hospitals to try to get a sense of how many people were killed in yesterday's protests. So far, we confirmed 8 casualties and 160 people who were injured, according to hospital and morgue officials. In terms of what to expect next, there's clearly going to be big protests tomorrow. Both in Nairobi and across the country, and the government has announced that they will deploy the military to help contain violence if needed.
As police deal with deadly protests back home, the first deployment of Kenyan police touched down in Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince. Haitian Prime Minister Gary Conille vowing to regain control of the country with the help of a long-awaited peacekeeping mission, as gang violence continues to ravage the Caribbean nation.
What's your message to journalists around the world today, Mr. Assange?
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange walks free, leaving a US court on the Pacific island of Saipan, after pleading guilty to one charge of violating US espionage law. The judge released Assange with a sentence of time already served in a deal that draws a line under his 14-year legal saga. He now heads home to Australia. French Prime Minister Gabriel Attal clashing with his left-wing and far-right political opponents, accusing them of, quote, promising the moon, in a TV debate Tuesday night ahead of snap elections. Opinion polls show the far-right National Rally likely to win the 2-round election starting this weekend, but without an absolute majority. France kicked off a trio of election debates this week, with the UK up next. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak goes toe-to-toe with leader of the opposition Keir Starmer tonight in their final debate ahead of the July 4th election. And then US President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump take to the debate stage on Thursday evening, their first face-off ahead of November. Evan Gershkovich, the American Wall Street Journal reporter detained in Russia, is on trial today over espionage charges. Reporters photographed and filmed him standing in a glass box in a courtroom in Yekaterinburg, just ahead of his trial. His head is shaved and he briefly smiles for the cameras. Gershkovich was arrested in March of 2023 and faces charges that carry up to 20 years in prison. The FSB says he was collecting secret information about a company that makes battle tanks. He and his newspaper reject the charges and the US government has designated him as wrongfully detained. But he's not the only American currently being held in Russia. Jonah spoke to Mark Trevelyan, our breaking news lead writer for Russia.
But we're aware of at least 8 other people who are American citizens or dual Russian-American citizens who are either serving time having been convicted of crimes in Russia or are still awaiting trial. The one with some similarities to Gershkovich is Alsu Kurmasheva because she's another journalist. She is a Russian-American dual national. She was born in Russia and worked as a journalist for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. She was arrested last year while visiting her mother in Russia, accused of violating Russia's foreign agent law, and later additionally with spreading false information about the armed forces, which is another pretty serious charge. Her family are seeking for her to be designated by the State Department, like Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, as wrongfully detained, which means that it commits the United States government to work for that person's release and is essentially saying that it considers the charges to be bogus.
And tell us about Paul Whelan, who's also been charged for espionage.
He's a former US Marine. He was arrested in 2018, and then in 2020 he was sentenced to 16 years in a penal colony. And the United States often raises his case in the same breath, as it were, as Evan Gershkovich's, because they have both had the same classification, so that there is pressure on the Biden administration over both of those cases, as well as some of the other lesser-known ones. All of these cases together form quite a long list of Americans serving time and offering Russia potential leverage in any negotiations with the United States.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That was Ronald Reagan's question to voters in 1980 as he was challenging then-President Jimmy Carter for the White House. Back then, inflation had risen to 12%. These days, it's a little over 3%. But it's a question likely to come up again as President Joe Biden faces former President Donald Trump in Thursday's debate. Of course, 4 years ago, we were stuck at home during a pandemic disinfecting our groceries, so the data is weird. But reporter Howard Schneider asked experts and voters to try to compare the normal, non-pandemic economies under Trump and Biden. So, Howard, how did analysts compare the two?
There's some classic touchstones here. Michael Strain at AAI I talked to, he said, listen, just flat out, cost of living, standard of living, cost-adjusted wages have gone down, right? And in fact, if you look at, say, real disposable personal income, it's risen a little bit. But if you draw a trend line from Trump's pre-pandemic years, what was it growing then? Inflation-adjusted incomes overall, through where we are in Biden terms right now, the economy is about $1 trillion short of where it would have been. Inflation and wages and incomes had continued growing as they were in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, okay? That's one way to look at it. You could look at it from a wealth perspective, though, okay, which is something that Karen Dine at Harvard focused in on. And she noted that you take all the assets, real estate, stock markets, et cetera, everything people own, minus everything they owe. And there's not only a lot more today, inflation adjusted, than there was then. It's distributed a little better, a little more fairly. And the gains in the bottom half of the wealth distribution, which claimed about a percentage point and a half greater share of all household wealth under Biden than before, the gain in that share grew both under Trump and Biden, but grew a little faster under Biden. So to that extent, better off now than then. You could argue it both ways.
For more deep dives into the economy, check out Carmel Crimin's podcast, Reuters Econ World. Today's episode will look at productivity and what Europe is doing to try and tackle it. That's it for Wednesday. We'll be back tomorrow with our daily headline show. And to never miss an episode, subscribe on your favourite podcast player or download the Reuters app.